All right, so I'm going to try to do something tonight that I have never done before. And so I want you guys to listen quickly so I can speak quickly, because there are 2 lessons I want to teach you tonight, so that I can be sure that we have a full presentation. Having you in front of me is so exciting. I wish I could spend like 5 hours just teaching you guys, because there is so much that I want to share with you. And so we're going to start off with this genealogy of the Constitution. I call it the roots of liberty, the history of our Constitution. Anybody know what a genealogy is? Shout it out for me. It's like your family tree. The Constitution has a family tree. Yes, you're supposed to thank you catching up with me. The Constitution has a family tree. Our Constitution was not written in 1787. There is nothing new, nothing novel, nothing invented in our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, or our Bill of Rights. Our framers, yes, were very intelligent, but even more so, they were very educated. And they were educated on their history. It is their history that gives us our Declaration, our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights. These 5 documents that I call the genealogy give us every aspect of these 3 documents. Nothing new, nothing invented, everything inherited from over 700 years. And there's something that we need to understand about our rights. And James Madison tells us in a dissertation that he wrote in 1792 called Property. He said, in a word, as a man is said to have a right in his property, he may be equally said to have a property in his rights. And what Madison is simply trying to remind us is that your property that your house is built upon, how many of you know your property is measured out and there are lines that are surveyed in property lines? You guys know that, right? So if a government agent came to your house and said to you or your parents, we have this survey of your home, we have your property lines. But we feel a little bit different about that today. And what we're going to do is reinterpret your property lines to come in on your property 10 feet on each side. How many of you think your parents would go along with that willingly? Of course not. But Madison is saying if you would not allow the government to reinterpret the property lines of your house, why would you allow them to reinterpret the property of your rights? For example, to tell you, that certain words are against the law. How many of you have heard that it's an exception to the First Amendment to yell fire in a crowded theater? Not true. There is no such exception in the First Amendment. You can yell fire in a crowded theater all day long and nobody's going to come in and arrest you. The illegal act of shouting fire in a crowded theater only happens when your words cause injury to someone else. But we have allowed our government through the Supreme Court to redefine our rights because we have forgotten that they are property as well. So what is the origin of American liberty? John Adams wrote in 1765 in a dissertation on feudal and canon law, liberty must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker. Now, John Adams is simply teaching us about natural law. How many of you heard about natural law? How many of you heard of a guy named John Locke? How many of you have read the complete treatise of John Locke? The complete treatise? Cool. Do you know, if we had asked that question in 1765, everyone would have raised their hands? Because it was common education to read the writings of Locke, Hobbes, Montesquieu, Algernon. And Adams is here telling us about natural law. We have our liberty is a gift from God because we are created in the nature of God. We are created in His image. And being created in the image of God means that we've inherited certain things from God. One thing that we've inherited from God is freedom. God is the most free being in the universe. Raise your hand if it's your job to wake up every day and tell God how to run things. We've inherited that freedom. But we don't want to live in a place where people are free. Because if we live in a place where people are free, that means I'm free to lie, I'm free to steal, and I'm free to murder. I am free to do whatever I want to do regardless of how that hurts you. The distinction we need to realize is that liberty and freedom are not the same thing. Freedom is what we've inherited from God, being created in His image. Liberty is freedom plus morality. That shared morality that says, I recognize that I'm free to lie and I'm free to steal and I am free to murder, but I will not because it's wrong. How many of you realize laws don't stop crimes? Okay? The criminal justice system wasn't even designed to stop criminal activity. If laws stopped crimes, we'd be a crime-free country because we got way too many laws. The only thing that stops people from doing bad things is a moral center, understanding that some things are wrong. And liberty is the expression of your freedom up into the point that it interferes with someone else's freedom and liberty. Now, Adams continues and says, but if we had not, our fathers have earned and bought it for us at the expense of their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. Adams is saying, I believe that liberty is a gift from God, but I also know that our fathers have secured and bought this liberty for us and for our posterity. Now, we don't know where we've come from anymore. We don't understand what this liberty is. We don't understand what where our Constitution came from. And so we don't understand how it's supposed to be applied and how it's supposed to work. We run to the Supreme Court to answer all our questions. We ask government to pass all these laws to regulate morality. And instead, we even as Christians beg the government to take the role of the Holy Spirit. When in reality, if we understood how the Constitution was supposed to work, we wouldn't need as many laws. And Christians would be more involved in taking care of the business of the church in the hedges of the highway than lobbying for morality in Washington, D.C. So here's how this works. Our Constitution has a history, and its history begins in 1014. How many of you realize, how many of you went through the Boston Tea Party Museum? Right? Okay. So we understand that our war for independence was not a foreign war. Do you understand that? Our war for independence was a civil war. British people fighting their British government. It was not a war between the Americans and the British. There were no Americans yet, except for the fact that they considered themselves American colonists. Colonists of what? Members of the government, the Kingdom of Great Britain, citizens of Great Britain, subjects to the Crown of Great Britain. And so, our constitutional history is one of British history. Our Constitution is a development from the English Constitution and from British common law. And if we're going to understand how it works, we need to understand where it came from. In 1014, the Anglo-Saxons, it wasn't England yet, it was just the Anglo-Saxons, were living in what we call small communities, like little towns. They had no central government. There was no state. It was just like this neighborhood and that neighborhood and this neighborhood. And they were conducting themselves very well. They were being very prosperous. But something very interesting was happening. Other kings from the outside were looking in on the Anglo-Saxons and saying, look at the prosperity these people have. Look at the success they're having in their small communities. But they're missing something. They don't have a king. They must need one. And so all these outside kings kept attacking them. And because they had no way to communicate, realize they didn't have Twitter in 1014, right? no text messaging, no cell phones. So when the kings, outside kingdoms would come and attack them, they had no way to quickly organize themselves for their common defense. And they had no way to easily communicate to prosper for their general welfare. I hope you're taking down these terms because this means something. And so they went to this man named Aethelred. And they said to Aethelred, Aethelred, you have been king over the Anglo-Saxons. Your family has, when we had Anglo-Saxon kings before. We want you to be king now. And we will allow you to be king on one condition. Your only job will be to communicate with foreign kings for treaties, for peace negotiations, and to help us organize for our common defense. You will leave us alone to govern ourselves in our small communities. Now, if we had been teaching you the Constitution the right way even for generations, right now every one of you would be like, oh yeah, okay, I see. Because that's the exact same agreement that the states made when they created the central government we call Washington, D.C. The Constitution was an agreement by the states that created the central government. James Madison tells us in Federalist Papers 45, the powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined. We made a box for them, few and defined. Those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. He says the powers delegated to the federal government by the Constitution are reserved to external objects. External objects, that's the way our founders talked about foreign affairs. And then Madison names those foreign affairs powers for us, so we didn't have to wait for the Supreme Court to do it. He calls them war, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce. How many of you realize that's the only power that was ever delegated to the federal government? To be an agent on behalf of the states in foreign affairs, war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. Because Madison then tells us that everything else, every other power, is reserved to the states. This was not an invention of our framers. This was an adaptation of the Aethelred Agreement. Now, 30 years later, we have a brand new king. His name is Edward the Confessor. Now, an interesting thing happens in human nature. How many of you have heard of a guy named Solomon? Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun, because human nature never changes. And a funny thing happens when you start calling somebody a king. You shouldn't be surprised when he starts acting like one. And then when the people start looking to the government to be their provider, don't be surprised when the people start acting like subjects. And so now we've gone 30 years. We have Edward the Confessor, and he is called a generous king. How many of you think under the original Aethelred Agreement, a king has the opportunity, the power to be generous? Is that war, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce? No. Well, they like Edward because people like free stuff, right? But Edward's about to die and he has no son. And they're concerned about who's going to take over the throne, because the next guy in line to take over the throne is a guy named William I. Now, when you don't have a direct heir to the throne, there's always a list of cousins, and William is the next cousin on the list. But they don't want William to be king because William is not Anglo-Saxon. William is Norman. And I just don't know why, but they don't want to have a foreign leader over their kingdom. Would you? A foreign king brings what? Foreign policies, right, and foreign law. And the interesting thing is, Norman kings do not rule like Anglo-Saxon kings. Anglo-Saxon kings are limited in their power, and Norman kings are completely unlimited. So the Anglo-Saxons hatch out a plan to appoint a guy named Harold to be king. Problem is, the year is 1066. We're not appointing kings. We're not electing kings. William catches wind that they're trying to pass him over from being king, and he gets mad, which is really bad news for the Anglo-Saxons because William has a nickname. He's called William the Conqueror. See that big sword there? What do you suppose happens when you make a guy mad whose nickname is the Conqueror? He's going to conquer. William raises his Norman army. He goes over and defeats Harold and the English people and makes himself king. Now William's up for the surprise because you see, William wants to rule as a Norman king with completely unlimited power. But he knows the Anglo-Saxons are not going to let him do that. Now kings have an interesting power called the power of decree. Kings can write laws that are legally binding on the people. And William could very well simply step up and say, I'm king now. I'm going to issue a decree that we will operate as Norman kingdoms instead of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Now, he could very well do that. But let me ask you a question. When you live in a kingdom and you don't like your king, do you start a recall petition to remove him from the throne? Do you find a new king to run against him in the next kingly election? No. What do you do when you don't like your king? Right. You have to form a rebellion and chop off his head. Now, William happens to be fond of his head. So he wants to make sure that he can rule the way he wants to and keep his head at the same time. So instead of issuing a decree to change the style of rule of the Anglo-Saxons, he decided it would be better to fundamentally transform the kingdom in such a way that the people would not notice their transformation. Now, the limiting factor was common law. So William wants to get rid of this common law. So the first thing he starts doing is replacing the judges in the common law system with judges who are not loyal to the common law, but loyal to the ideology of the king. He starts then using those judges to enforce his foreign Norman law on the Anglo-Saxon people, even when it's contrary to their law. He starts chasing the private landowners off of their land with threat and force. Literally chasing some of them out of the kingdom. Maybe they had a spotted owl issue that needed protecting or something, right? Now, an interesting thing happens in a kingdom. When land is abandoned, the ownership of that land reverts back to the king. And so now William says, oh, look, amazing. There's all this abandoned land. How did that happen? Well, since it now belongs to me, I'm going to start inviting all my foreign friends to come live in this kingdom. How else do you keep foreign law in a kingdom unless it's full of people who like the foreign law better than the common law of the land? William starts replacing the leadership in the churches with men who are not loyal to the word of God, but loyal to the ideology of the king. So now William can take control of the churches and make the people do things even when those things are contrary to the word of God, perhaps like abortion. Now, this transformation takes place over a period of about 40 years through the reign of William I and his son, William II. Now, William II is described as being a wicked, evil king just like his father. His nickname is William the Red. Can you figure out why? Now, the good news is, as some of you already noticed, William II is only going to rule for about 13 years. Because one day, William II and his little brother, Henry I, here's Henry, go hunting together. And William William II is killed in a mysterious hunting accident when someone in Henry I's hunting party accidentally shoots his brother in the eye, killing him, making Henry king. How many of you think this was an accident? Well, neither did the people of England. Now, killing your brother to become king doesn't make you a popular king, even if they didn't like your brother. Because if you'll kill your brother, then what are the people to you, right? So William has to do some things to make the people happy. He does a number of things, but for us tonight, the most important thing William's going to do, he's going to sign the very first document in our genealogy of the Constitution. This is called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. The 1100 Charter of Liberties is Henry's promise that government will never be evil and oppressive again. How's that working out for us? Look at this promise. Henry makes a list of 14 promises. Henry promises, if any of my baron or earls shall die, his heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. Henry's simply saying is that if the heirs of an estate have to purchase their estate from the government before they can receive it, you have an evil and oppressive government. How many adults is that ringing bells with? How many of you guys have heard of something called inheritance tax? Death tax. How is it that a king in 1100 knew that inheritance tax was the mark of an evil and oppressive government, and today we allow our government to call it revenue? Now, Henry's not interested in liberty. He's interested in keeping his head. But now the people have a promise in writing, signed by the king, things that government can never do. And they're going to need this promise because in 100 years, they're going to have the most evil and oppressive king they will ever know. His name is John. John is a massive taxation king, and if you can't pay your taxes in John's kingdom, you're going to be arrested. You're going to be thrown into prison. You're going to be mutilated. He is cutting off hands, feet, ears, cutting the tongues out of people who cannot afford to pay their taxes. They called him ruthless and vicious. They said even hell was fouled by the presence of John. That makes him a pretty bad guy, right? You guys know John, by the way. How many of you heard of a guy named Robin Hood? That's the king in the Robin Hood story. All right, so let me ask you, listen very closely to this question and be sure to answer the question that I'm asking. Are you ready? What are we taught about Robin Hood that makes him famous? Just shout it out. You guys. Rob from the rich and give to the poor. Only that's a big fat lie. Robin Hood was not robbing from the rich to give to the poor in an effort to redistribute wealth. Robin Hood was taking from the king and the crown the money that had been stolen from the people through unlawful and oppressive taxation, returning it back to the people so they could live. Remember, John's going to execute you if you can't pay your taxes. Robin Hood's not trying to put people on equal financial footing. He's giving people their lives back. He is not a socialist. He's a liberty fighter. Because the first step to liberty is always a right to life. If you don't live, what kind of liberty can you enjoy? Now, from John, a rebellion comes against John because John is going to involve himself in the church. The people have chosen a man by the name of Stephen Langton to be the head of their church. John says, I don't like this guy because he's not going to listen to me. I'm going to pick the head of your church. But the people say, hey, John, the king made us a promise in 1100 that you would no longer be evil and oppressive. That 1100 Charter of Liberties makes us a very important promise. The very first promise ever made in the 1100 Charter of Liberties declared that the church would be completely free from government intrusion. By the way, that's where you get separation of church and state from. It is not something that Thomas Jefferson invented in 1802 when he wrote the letter to the Danbury Baptists. It was not invented by our framers through the ratification of our First Amendment. No, they learned from their history that when government is in your church, it's an evil and oppressive government. A rebellion forms against John, and we get the second document in our genealogy. This one's called the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta is an amazing document. Pop quiz number 1. You ready? Who wrote the 1100 Charter of Liberties? Just shout it out. King Henry I. The Magna Carta was not written by a king. The Magna Carta was written by the people. An amazing document. The people saying, hey, you made us a promise in 1100 that government would never be evil and oppressive. You obviously have no idea how to keep that promise. So now we, the people, are going to rise in our majesty. We're going to place ourselves above the king and tell the king what he can and cannot do. The Magna Carta creates a committee of 25 men called the Royal Council who will sit in the king's court with the power to tell the king, no, you can't do that because it breaks your promise. Our 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th amendments in our Bill of Rights come from clauses 38 through 40 in the Magna Carta. We did not invent them. We inherited them. Clause 61 of the Magna Carta gives us a very important part of our First Amendment as well. Clause 61 of the Magna Carta says the people have a right to petition the government for a redress of their grievances. We did not invent that. We inherited it. How many of you think that kings being told what to do by people is going to go over well? For the next 400 years, the people are going to be fighting with kings and queens to maintain their control and the power over their liberty. So we're going to fast forward to 1625. The king's name is Charles I. He's a handsome guy, and he's a party animal. As a matter of fact, they say of Charles I that he loves to romp about Europe, spending on his every whim and fancy. Whose money is Charles spending? How is he collecting their money? Taxes. Now, Charles has a problem because that royal council is now called Parliament. And Parliament is sick and tired of Charles' wasteful spending. They stand up to Charles and say, we're not going to pass any more of your laws until you get your spending under control. They literally say, we're going to defund the king until he gets a proper budget. Charles says, okay, fine, but let me remind you of something. I'm king. Why do I even need a parliament? And he dissolves Parliament. Now, did he have to have somebody come and arrest Parliament? Couldn't he have just simply said, where Parliament refuses to legislate, I'll just go ahead and regulate? Could he have held a State of the Kingdom address and said, if Parliament will not pass laws, I will. After all, I have a quill and a messenger. Does that sound familiar to anybody? And then if Parliament acts like they have no power, then they really are powerless, aren't they? Well, Charles has a problem. He wants to keep spending the people's money, so he has to keep collecting the people's money. But he can't pass a tax because there is no Parliament. So he comes to the people and he says, look, I don't want you to get upset. I'm going to be issuing a decree to collect your money, but it's not a tax, so don't worry about it. Because I'm calling it a forced loan. A rebellion begins against Charles. The people say, tax, mandate, we don't care what you call this. This is a violation of our Constitution, and we will not comply. In this rebellion, we get the third document. This one's called the Petition of Right of 1628. The Petition of Right is where we get our Third Amendment. It says you cannot quarter soldiers in our homes. As a matter of fact, it says you can't even declare martial law on us unless we're being invaded by a foreign nation. Now, Charles is going to sign this Petition of Right because he has a sword at his throat. but the people are going to let him stay king. How many of you think Charles has learned his lesson and he's going to be a good king now? Charles goes back to business as usual, and in 20 years, less than 20 years, we are back in a new rebellion with Charles, bringing us the fourth document in our genealogy. This one's called the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. The Grand Remonstrance of 1641 reads, "The root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design, subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom." They said, we've been watching kings for 600 years, and we're starting to notice a pattern in their behavior. Corruption of the court system, infiltration of foreign law, diminishing the property rights of the people, the government taking control of the church, the government creating fiat money to control the monetary system, and the government disarming the people while the government remained armed. A design recognized in 1641 whose only purpose was to destroy liberty. Now, Charles is brought up on charges of treason, found guilty, and they chop off his head. And 40 years later, we have a brand new king, same old design. James II. Now, James II has learned I can take anything from the people that I want as long as I can give them something to distract them from what I'm taking. And so James is going to try to take a whole bunch of stuff. He's going to get up and do something really big. I'm going to issue a decree to give you something you've never had before. I'm going to give you religious liberty. As a matter of fact, you never have to be a member of the Church of England anymore. You can have church anywhere you want, with any pastor you want. You can preach anything you want, anytime you want, and the government will not prosecute you or persecute you. On one condition. Before you have church, you must inform the king where you'll be meeting, when you'll be meeting, who will be preaching, what will be said, and you must promise that you will never, ever say anything bad about the king in church. That doesn't sound like religious liberty to me. That sounds like a 501c3. How many of you know what a 501c3 is? Ask your parents. A rebellion comes against James, which brings us the fifth document in our genealogy. This one's called the English Bill of Rights of 1689. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 says, whereas the late King James II, with the assistance of evil judges, counselors, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of this kingdom. Extirpate. I didn't know what that was. I had to look it up. It means to completely destroy. They said what James was doing was completely destroying liberty, and they made a whole list of things. One of those things I want to show you today, because I'm trying to show you we didn't invent anything in our Constitution. Every single principle was inherited over these 700 years. The English Bill of Rights says that James was completely destroying liberty by writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law, when that was a power reserved to the legislative branch alone. How many of you heard of separation of powers? They had separation of powers in 1688. Separation of powers says you can't share power and you can't steal it. And they said that when the executive branch in the king was writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law, stealing power from the legislative branch of Parliament, the only result could ever be the complete destruction of liberty. How is it that a people of 1688 with no internet, no cell phones, no Google, no CNN, no MSNBC, no Fox realized that executive orders were the complete destruction of liberty, and today our legislative branch, Congress, does nothing? How many of you guys have heard of executive orders? That's exactly what a kingly decree is. Do you know what? Little question, little pop quiz. See if you know this. I haven't given you the answer to this one yet. Anybody know the date of the last decree ever issued by a king of Great Britain? James II in 1688. Our presidents exercise more power than British kings have exercised since 1688. So now we have George III and the Declaration of Independence. Our war for independence was not about tea. It was not even about a tax on tea. Sam Adams sort of alluded to it at the Boston Museum, but the truth of the matter is, Great Britain kept passing laws in Parliament to be enforced on the colonists without giving them representation. The colonists kept saying, these laws you're passing on us are without our representation. That is a right that has been guaranteed to us since 1215. Parliament said, don't be ridiculous. Of course you have representation. We have people in Parliament who have volunteered to represent your interests. The colonists said, if they're over there making laws on the island to be enforced on our continent, and they never have to live under those laws, then they don't represent us. They only represent themselves. Now, they tried to pass these series of taxes. Well, they passed these series of taxes to collect the debt accrued in the French and Indian War. They taxed linen, lumber, sugar, tea, paper, and ink, the stuff that the colonists had to have survive. And then they got a brilliant idea. We can maximize our revenue from these taxes by mandating that the colonists purchase the taxed items. We will make it against the law for them to buy anything we don't approve. And then to make sure that they're buying the right stuff instead of boycotting, we will pass a law called Writs of Assistance that gives our customs agents and our tax collectors the power to search and seize without proper warrants. We didn't invent the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects from unreasonable searches and seizures, our Fourth Amendment. We inherited that from the Magna Carta. And then if an agent raids your house and finds something he doesn't think you're supposed to have, or maybe he just doesn't like you, you are arrested, thrown into prison, and transported to Quebec for your trial. Now, Quebec was a British colony at the time, but it was a unique British colony because Quebec had petitioned the British Parliament to retain their French law. And French law doesn't give you a trial by a jury of your peers. That was something unique to British law. Our independence movement was not over taxes. It was over legislation without representation, mandated purchases, warrantless searches, denial of due process, and foreign courts and foreign law. And that's how we got the Declaration of Independence. What kind of government were we prior to our independence? Everybody, not all at once. Come on now. A kingdom. What is a kingdom? A kingdom is where the king holds all the rights and all the power, hands them out to the people as he sees fit. And when he wants to take them back, what can he do? Take them back. Our framers said, you know what? This kingdom thing isn't working out for us so well because kings only keep their promises as long as the people hold the sword to their throat. The minute the sword goes down, the king goes back to being king and people go back to being subjects. So they said, guess what? We're not going to do the kingdom thing anymore. We're going to be free men in a republic. A constitutional republic, to be specific. Now, how many of you remember from your history lessons that shortly after our first independence war, people were begging George Washington to be king? We should be thankful that some of our framers realized that the king thing wasn't working. Now, what is a republic? A republic is where the people hold all the rights and delegate power to the government as they see fit. Remember that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. What did I just quote? The Declaration of Independence. Very good. Deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. And if we are delegating power to the government, what can we do? Say that louder. Take it back. That when any form of government operates contrary to these means, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish that government, establishing new governments that will live towards these principles. Also, the Declaration of Independence. Now, I know many of you know friends, and many of our adults know adults and politicians and talking heads on TV who think we are not a republic but a democracy. How many of you heard that? Now, I know you guys know the difference, but I think we need to learn what the difference really is so that we can defeat this. Because I think if we knew the difference between a democracy and a republic, we wouldn't simply shake our head and roll our eyes when we hear people call it a democracy. You see, a democracy is no different from a kingdom. The only difference between a democracy and a kingdom is how many people rule over you. In a kingdom, a monarchy, it's just one. In a democracy, it's many. Majority rule. So, in a democracy, the majority holds all the power, hands out the rights and the privileges to the minority as they see fit. And if you live in a democracy and they're handing out the rights, what can they do? Take them away. So if you live in a democracy and you are a member of a minority community, you have nothing unless the majority says so. And what you have, you only have as long as they say so. How many of you heard of the civil rights movement? How many of you know a name, Rosa Parks? Do you know that Rosa Parks proves that we're not a democracy? If we had been a democracy, Rosa Parks would still be in the back of a bus. Because in a democracy, minority groups never have a society-changing voice. That only happens in a constitutional republic where laws are made by equal representation. So you want to be a democracy? Let your friends and family members and coworkers and television people and politicians continue to call us one. Because you repeat a lie long enough, it becomes the truth. Now, you might not mind being called a democracy. That might be good for you as long as you're on the right side of the mob. The minute you find yourself in the minority, however, you have nothing. Because our framers knew that democracies do not preserve liberty. The only thing a democracy will preserve is that there will always be masters and always be slaves. They gave us a constitutional republic, and the Constitution tells us why. To preserve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The main focus of our framers was liberty. Liberty must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker, derived from natural law, the laws of nature and the nature's God. Genesis 1:26, we are created in the image of God. What is a liberty? Liberty is freedom plus morality. Why? Because laws can't change the heart. Now, this is how you get in contact with me. And I have 10 minutes left. And I want to explain something to you very, very important about the nature of who we are in this 10 minutes. So I want you to listen very, very closely. Listen quickly so I can talk quickly. How about that? I'm going to show you this. Come on. Wake up. This is a lesson that I teach to state legislators and local representatives, county commissioners, city councilmen. I've taught Utah, Arizona, Kansas, and Oregon. I'm scheduling to teach Washington and Idaho. And I spoke to a representative in Massachusetts yesterday who is talking about bringing me in to teach there. And I want to show you something. are the states? We created 13 states in 1776. And which came first, the federal government or the states? Well, that's a no-brainer, right? But I think if we really thought about that, we would operate differently in our daily lives. Because the truth of the matter is, we did not become states on July 4th, 1776, with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We became states on July 2nd, 1776, with the ratification of the Lee Resolution. The Lee Resolution was a 3-step process to being independent from Great Britain. It was brought before the Continental Congress on July 2nd, debated, voted, and ratified into law. Our states became states free from Great Britain by an act of congressional law, just as legally binding as anything that our Congress does today that is constitutional, which means our states existed prior to the Declaration of Independence. They existed prior to the Articles of Confederation. How many of you know what the Articles of Confederation is? It's our first attempt at a union. Now, there were lots of problems with it, and that's a whole nother lesson we can't get into today, but we had to move on to our new Constitution, which is why they call it the more perfect union. Now, interesting, in this spot right here, this blank spot, we dissolved the Articles of Confederation, which means in this spot right here, there is no legislative branch, no executive branch, and no judicial branch. And the only governments that exist right here are what? The states. The states are the creators of the Constitution, which means they are the creators of the central government. Now, what are states? This is the last paragraph to the Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, is nearly verbatim to the first clause of the Lee Resolution. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America. Now, that is not talking about our union, okay? Because, see, this U is not capitalized. United States of America is not a proper noun. That word united is an adjective describing the states are being united in this declaration. So there is no United States of America here, just the states. Representatives of these states of United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies. Now that phrase is going to jump out in George III's face and spit right in his eye. Because people who live in a kingdom have no authority. And now the people are saying we are not only have authority, we are declaring ourselves free by our own authority. Why? Because we are created in the nature of God. God gave us freedom, gave us our independence, and we don't need your permission for it anymore. That these colonies solemnly publish and declare. See, we didn't become independent. We simply published and declared what we had already done 2 days prior. That these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Now, we were colonies and we are states now, which means there's a difference, right? There must be a difference. Do I still have you with me? Okay. So what is the difference between a colony and a state? Yes, sir. How about I help you out? A colony is not independent and free. A colony can do nothing unless the king says you do it or you don't do it. You have to receive permission from the king and the crown to do anything when you're in a colony. A state, however, is free and independent. But what does that word state mean? And here we go with the rest of the Declaration of Independence. That free and independent states that they're absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the what? State of Great Britain. When we created 13 independent sovereign states That word state is not simply unanimous with New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. That word state is synonymous with France, Spain, and Great Britain. We didn't create 13 colonies to be subsets of a federal union. We created 13 independent, sovereign countries. Now look, because I'm not making this up. It's right here. And they are between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states like Great Britain, they have. Look at the power our states were created with. Full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states like Great Britain, France, and Spain have a right to do. The people of New Hampshire, of Massachusetts, need to realize that you are a state, which means you are independent countries. And nothing has changed. Somebody will try to tell you, well, you surrendered that power when you joined the Union. That is legally impossible and just as ridiculous. How many of you have heard of a sovereign country called Germany? How many of you realize the sovereign country of Germany joined the European Union? So fly over to Germany and tell the German people and the German chancellor that they are no longer a sovereign country because they joined the European Union. How do you think they're going to take that news? They're going to laugh at you, right? So I want to ask you, Americans who live in the country of New Hampshire, in the country of Massachusetts, in the country of California, and the country of Florida, why do we accept it? We are countries, not subjects to the federal government. Somebody will say, because I live in Florida and we weren't part of the first 13, that doesn't count for us. Unfortunately, for that argument, even the Supreme Court disagrees with a doctrine called the equal footing doctrine, which says every state that enters the Union after the first 13 enters on the same, with the same footprint as the first 13. And here's that footprint right there. We never surrendered any power. We simply delegated it. Power was delegated by this Constitution. The states are the creators of the central government. They enumerated its specific powers, created a limited central government, and in this spot, they're going to do the most important thing they will ever do. Are you ready? They reserved all other powers to themselves. War, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce are the only powers that were ever delegated to the federal government. Those powers associated with foreign affairs, the federal government was created by the states to be an ambassador on behalf of the states to foreign affairs, and they were supposed to leave the states alone to govern themselves with all the rest of the power. Is marriage war, peace, negotiation, or foreign commerce? Is education war, peace, negotiation, or foreign commerce? Is the environment war, peace, negotiation, or foreign commerce? Is land management war, peace, negotiation, or foreign commerce? Is homeland security war, peace, negotiation, or foreign commerce? No. By the very name of homeland, it is a power that is reserved to the states. And if we realized who we were, we'd realize that we don't have to submit to anything that the federal government does outside the Constitution. We got to know where we came from. We got to know who we are if we are going to get control and maintain our republic. Now let me show you guys something. I have stuff over here. This book contains the history lesson that I just taught you. Has mini biographies on founders and framers that you won't get to hear about anywhere else. This book, Sovereign Duty, contains the complete lesson that I don't have time to teach you, the one that I teach to the legislators, and then some. And so we have lots of resources for you guys over here on the table to carry with you. I will be teaching tomorrow at 10 a.m. as well. Thank you.